Dear listeners, welcome to the BNTV channel. By subscribing to our channel, you can follow our independent comments on the latest news. After the 4th of July, U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria carried out a series of attacks against their military bases and the Iraqi embassy. After this series of attacks at the beginning of the week, second-wave attacks were made against almost the same targets with the same method. It was confirmed that 3 rockets were fired at the U.S. Embassy in Iraq in the early hours of Thursday morning. The embassy has been targeted for the second time since the beginning of the week. This embassy was attacked with a drone on Monday. There have been similar waves of attacks in the past years. The United States did not retaliate, describing these as domestic attacks. As a result, according to reports, 196 U.S. soldiers died. One of the main reasons for the U.S.'s failure to retaliate may be that the groups that claimed the attack were unable to prove their definitive ties to Iran, or that they could not risk a war against Iran in Iraq. There is Russia, which maintains its radical presence in the region, and China, which supports Iran from the shadows. Also, the onset of the attack waves comes at the same time as the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Bagram, the epicenter in Afghanistan. This is not a coincidence and can be thought of as an attempt by Iran to likewise force the U.S. troops to withdraw from Iraq and Syria. Compared to the U.S. in the Middle East, which we have been watching since 2003, the statements made by the U.S. administration regarding the attacks are not threatening. It seems they want to avoid a possible war, but they are not very willing to withdraw from the region. When will the patience of the U.S. administration run out as the severity and frequency of attacks increase? Could there be another retaliation against Iranian-backed militants? What could Iran be trying to do by provoking the United States so much? Is it best for U.S. troops to leave the Middle East and go back home? Now let's examine the details of the second-wave attack on the U.S. Embassy in Iraq and the U.S. bases in Syria. 3 rockets were fired at the U.S. Embassy in Iraq early Thursday, the Iraqi army said, at the end of a day marked by rocket and drone attacks on bases hosting American forces in Iraq and Syria. The embassy itself was not hit, the army said, but 3 nearby places in Baghdad's heavily fortified Green Zone were. Sirens blared from the embassy compound inside the zone, which houses government buildings and foreign missions. 2 Katyusha rockets fell near the National Security Building, and in an open courtyard inside the Green Zone. A 3rd rocket fell in a nearby residential area, damaging a civilian vehicle, the statement by the Iraqi security media cell said. The attack, which came shortly before daybreak, followed 2 separate attacks on bases housing U.S. troops in western Iraq and across the border in Syria, where U.S.-led coalition forces are based. The drone attack Wednesday in eastern Syria was foiled while 14 rockets landed in Al-Assad Air Base in western Iraq, lightly wounding 2 personnel. The attacks come as tension is on the rise between U.S. troops and Iran-backed fighters as Baghdad and Washington negotiate a timeline for foreign troop withdrawal from Iraq. The U.S. has blamed Iran-backed militias for attacks, most of them rocket strikes, that have targeted the American presence in Baghdad and military bases across Iraq. More recently, the attacks have become more sophisticated, with militants using drones. Late last month, U.S. warplanes hit facilities used by Iran-backed militia groups which the Pentagon said support drone strikes inside Iraq. 4 Iraqi fighters were killed in the June 27 airstrikes. A previously unknown group claimed responsibility for the Wednesday attack on Al-Assad Air Base, saying it was a message to U.S. troops in Iraq: "We will force you to leave our lands defeated." A drone attack on Tuesday was reported on Erbil Airport in the northern Kurdish Run region, near where U.S. forces are based. In Syria, the U.S.-backed and Kurdish-led forces said they foiled the Wednesday attack that was using drones on the Al Omar oil field in the eastern province of Deir el-Zor. Hundreds of U.S. troops are stationed in northeastern Syria, working with the Kurdish-led fighters in battling the Islamic State group. Thousands of Iran-backed militiamen from around the Middle East are deployed in different parts of Syria, many of them in areas along the border with Iraq. A statement from the security media cell, affiliated with Iraq's security forces, on Thursday said these attacks endangers the lives of citizens and targets diplomatic missions and will be faced forcefully. Iraq's government had called Wednesday's attack a terrorist one that violate Iraqi laws. Also on Thursday, the spokesman for the U.S.-led coalition Colonel Wayne Maroto said these attacks undermine the authority of Iraqi authorities, the rule of law and Iraqi national sovereignty. Our frontline forces against ISIL and coalition forces in the area of the Omar oilfield dealt with drone attacks, the Kurdish-led SDF said. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, a Britain-based war monitor with sources in Syria, said pro-Iran groups had probably launched the drones from a rural area outside the town of Al-Mayadeen southwest of the oilfield. It was the second such attack in days, after the SDF reported 2 unidentified rocket-propelled grenades landed on the western side of the Al-Omar oilfield, late on Sunday, which caused no casualties. Separately, the Pentagon said a drone had been brought down in eastern Syria and that no U.S. service members had been injured and there had not been any damage. A spate of recent attacks on U.S. military and diplomatic facilities in Iraq has been blamed on pro-Iranian armed groups within a state-sponsored paramilitary force. U.S. forces, who have 2,500 troops deployed in Iraq as part of an international anti-Islamic State group coalition, have been targeted almost 50 times this year in the country, but the last few days have seen an increase in the frequency of attacks. Daily rocket and drone attacks on the U.S. in Iraq are no longer just the harassment that began in May 2019. The targeted attacks are increasing, and they also involve more sophisticated drones than in the past. While there have been no American deaths from these attacks since the spring of 2020, the overall picture is of a rising conflict in which Iran has declared war on the U.S. and Iraq. The latest attack took place Thursday morning on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. It followed daily attacks against U.S. forces in Erbil, capital of the Kurdistan region in Iraq, al-Assad base in western Iraq, and the targeting of U.S. forces in Syria since July 4. Iran has done this before, using pro-Iranian groups in Iraq to wage an insurgency against the U.S. after the U.S.-led 2003 invasion of Iraq. In a twist of irony, Washington had gone into Iraq to remove Saddam Hussein. Saddam was a vicious opponent of Iran, who also committed genocide against Iraqis, targeting Kurds and Shiites. Once he was gone, however, the Iranians moved into Iraq, using pro-Iran Shiite groups, such as the Badr organization. They then mobilized proxies to attack the U.S. This resulted in hundreds of American soldiers being killed. But the U.S. did not retaliate, preferring the illusion that these were some kind of indigenous attacks. Iran aided its pro-Iranian militias in Iraq with weapons, including 107mm rockets and explosively formed penetrators. The EFPs killed at least 196 American troops, according to reports. That appeared to end in 2011 when the U.S. left Iraq. It returned in 2014 to fight ISIS, and for a while, the U.S. was not targeted. However, in 2017, the pro-Iran militias, led by Kataib Hezbollah, Assaib al-Haq and others, said the U.S. should leave Iraq. It did not leave, since it had been invited by the Iraqi government. The official line of the U.S.-led coalition is that the attacks against its forces in Iraq endanger Iraqis. This is true. Some Iraqis have been wounded and even killed. Each attack against the government of Iraq, Kurdistan region of Iraq and the coalition undermines the authority of Iraqi institutions, the rule of law and Iraqi national sovereignty, coalition spokesman Colonel Wayne Maroto tweeted Thursday. These attacks endanger the lives of Iraqi civilians, and the partner forces from the Iraqi security forces, Peshmerga and coalition. However, the larger context is that it is not just harming Iraqis. This is a concerted and coordinated campaign against the U.S. It is not a simple campaign, either. The use of drones in attacks is part of a new strategy. So far, the strategy appears to be designed not to inflict many casualties on the U.S. In fact, the rocket barrages have been relatively small, sometimes up to a dozen rockets, but usually just a few. A drone struck a CIA hangar in Erbil in April, appearing to send a message that Iran knows where America's secrets are hidden. Drones also targeted an area where the new U.S. consulate is being built near Erbil in the Kurdistan region. The message is that the U.S. is not safe in Kurdistan, a peaceful and usually safe area. Iran's use of drones and rockets provided to the militias in Iraq against diplomatic sites and also against the U.S. military is unprecedented. While Iran has supplied rockets and drones to Hamas and Hezbollah, in Iraq, the role of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and Iran's guidance appears more closely linked to Tehran. This is because it is clear that Tehran can dial up the attacks when it wants to. This time the escalation began on July 4. It was a message that coincided with the U.S. leaving Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. Iran thinks it can push the U.S. out of Iraq at the same time.
Don't forget to like our video and subscribe for our channel.